I think oftentimes people confuse moral empathy with intuitive empathy because we often label these two different things as the same thing, as just being empathy. So we have intuitive empathy. This is empathy which is not necessarily pragmatic. It's not necessarily conscious. It's certainly not a choice. We have this kind of intuitive empathy when we see a hurt animal or a dying animal. Now, when I see a hurt or dying animal, it's not in my genetic interest to save the animal, to nurture the animal, to help the animal, or to put down the animal. Nothing I do for that animal is going to help my wallet. It's not going to help me have more children. There's no benefit for me being empathetic toward the animal. And we feel this gut level empathy, not just for animals, but for other people. But I think the example of animals is important because it's an area where a lot of people have no empathy whatsoever. And it's an area where other people have an extreme empathy. So there are some people who have absolutely no empathy. These are the kind of people who work in for example, a factory farm, where the conditions, it's literally an animal holocaust on a daily basis. You're just shoveling animals through these crowded conditions, these depraved conditions. You're killing them in inhumane ways. So, some people can do that. And there are certainly people who abuse animals, who are actually sadistic toward animals. People who, kick cats down the stairs. People who, don't feed their dog. They beat their dogs, right? These people just don't have a lot of empathy. This intuitive empathy. And often we draw correlations in sociological data between what we call empathy or conscientiousness and intelligence. So we say that the lower your intelligence is, the more likely you are to be sadistic, the more likely are you to be a sociopath, the more likely you are to be lacking empathy. And so low IQ people living in poor regions of the globe, Africa as a continent, sub-Saharan Africa, or Detroit, or Baltimore, or Newark, or Compton. These are the regions of the world where we see this abuse of animals. The pit bull problem. We see this abuse of animals, and we see animals being tortured in cruel ways. Now, one of the most dangerous things, I suppose, would be is if someone goes outside this trend. If someone's a very intelligent sociopath, then that's dangerous. Because we know how to handle dumb sadists, they sort of expose themselves. And they're not very intelligent. They don't rise up to the top of society. But intelligent sociopaths, they're intelligent enough to hide their lack of empathy. Now, I think the majority of people are sociopathic to the extent that they profess empathy where they do not have empathy. So there's a certain gut level empathy that you could be alone walking in the woods and you see a deer that is limping, or you see a rabbit that has been bitten by a cat, and you want to help the rabbit, you want to help the deer. You feel sad. No one's around. You're not doing it for social signaling points. You're not doing it just because someone's watching you. You have this instinctual response. You see something weak, you see something dying, you want to help it. And that is the mothering instinct, right? And men or women, it doesn't matter. There's still an element of the mothering instinct. Now, women, it's usually more frequent. Men, it's less frequent. But it's not exclusive to women, the mothering instinct. There are some people who don't have it at all, and there are some people who have it to an extreme extent. So cat ladies, people who just can't help but help the helpless, help the defenseless. And they're obsessed with infantilizing the animals around them or the people around them. Now, most people are not extreme empaths. Most people are not extremely empathetic. Most people, a lot of their professed empathy is moral empathy. That is, they know they are supposed to act empathetic, and so they act empathetic. And the depth of morality and the extent to which a person becomes hardwired into a certain morality actually deceives the person into confusing and lying to themselves and confusing their genuine intuitive empathy from their moral empathy. So, for instance, if I have a good friend or family member or a pet, and someone hurts this animal or this person that's close to me, I'm going to feel this empathy. I'm going to feel, or a bad thing happens, it's a storm, an accident, a car accident, something bad happens. I'm going to feel bad. I might even cry because I'm sad that someone I love or an animal that I love has been hurt. That's intuitive empathy. Now, if you tell me that somewhere across the world someone is being persecuted because they're a minority or something like that, and I have nothing to do with these people. I mean, I could just make something up. And this has been done, right? You could go up to a young woman on a college campus, because young women on college campuses are the most, ignorant, and they're the most sensitive in terms of being their moral or their empathic intuition is high, because they're young women of childbearing age, so the mothering instinct is high. So their empathic intuition is high, and their empathic morality is also high. Now, when a woman gets married, she stops caring about other people's kids. She focuses in on her children exclusively. And so she actually loses a lot of her empathic intuition. If you look at the rise and fall of empathic intuition, children have very, very little empathic intuition. Those children who actually do have empathic intuition are like angels, basically. And those are found in very exclusive populations. That's not a general thing. Most children are little sadists, and they actually enjoy hurting other people, and they're not very sad when other people are hurt. So as a child matures and grows and ages, the moral intuition, or excuse me, I'm confusing things here. The empathic intuition, the intuitive empathy, or the instinctual or genetic empathy increases over time, especially for women, because they're getting ready to have children of their own. And when they have children of their own, they're going to be meeting those children for the first time, and they're going to form that attachment, and they're going to need this reservoir of empathy to pour out upon that helpless infant in order to nurture it and take care of it and raise it. So there's a reservoir potential of empathy that builds up within young women, and then after they hit peak childbearing years, it starts to decline generally. And by the time a woman is married and she has children, she might stop being empathetic. So you can look at various social issues to test this theory of mine. And you could look at something like immigration. So women as children aren't, you can just tell, a child will parrot anything. A child doesn't necessarily have a lot of empathic intuition or intuitive empathy. And so that's something that sort of grows over time and then peaks at a certain stage. I mean, other people could claim, no, I know these kids who are extremely empathic when they're young and they're innocent, and then as they lose their innocence and become cynical, their heart hardens and they become less empathetic. And that's something, again, we'd have to look at child psychology. We'd have to hash it out in that way. But clearly, after the 20s, I think we can all agree that that is a period at which empathy is very high and it starts to decline. Whether it was higher before in childhood or not, that's a different question. But the other aspect is the moral empathy. And children, again, they will they will parrot things, but the degree to which they are able to cognitively map a moral system and to internalize it and then to regurgitate it is something that we really don't gain that ability strongly until adolescence and adulthood. So both in terms of moral empathy and intuitive empathy, they both peak in women of childbearing age. So college-age women have the highest moral empathy and the highest intuitive empathy. And so if you go up to a college-age woman and you say, the Tiki-Tonga of Nepal are being oppressed. And if you throw in the right keywords and you say, the Tiki-Tonga of Nepal are being oppressed because of the history of, white imperialism and white colonialism, they're actually a darker skin tone as an ethnic group than the other Nepalese. And so because of the history of white racism and colonialism, other Nepalese actually discriminate against the Tiki-Tonga And there's currently a genocide underway. I mean, there's been all kinds of religious prohibitions. There's been, in the Tiki Tonga, they're actually a matriarchal ethnic group where the women are in control. And the other Nepalis, they don't like this. And so they've started to rape a lot of Tiki Tonga women. And, I could just go on all the, the typical canards. These are canards, right? These are anti-white canards. And we could go down the list and say, will you sign this petition to help the Tiki Tonga? And, of course, Tiki Tonga is not a very realistic-sounding name. You'd have to come up with a name that sounded more realistic. But you could come up with a completely false and fake scenario, and you would get these college-age women to sign on to it. Why? Because their moral I keep messing up these terms. I got to come up with different terms. But their instinctual empathy is high. Their gut level empathy is high, and also their ideological empathy is high, their moral empathy, their empathic morality, which is not empathy actually, but it is a simulacra of empathy. It is a show of empathy because they're trying to fit into the paradigm, the moral paradigm. So, this being the case, I see a total destruction of empathy in our current age. There's a lot of stuff being done to counteract this trend, like the anti-bullying campaign. There's a lot of stuff put out there that's like, won't you feel bad for the refugees? Don't you feel bad for women? Don't you feel bad for minorities? And I feel like everyone is just sort of running out of juice. And a lot of it comes from Christianity and post-Christianity. But in terms of, and I've had people comment when I talk about the 5 Christianizations, which wasn't a very well-received video, by the way. I don't know why. Maybe because it was dark. But the 5 Christianizations video, I talked about post-Christianity, and people said, oh, well, that's just social justice warriors. Those are the post-Christians. I said, well, it seems like something's coming after them here. It seems like you have these radical anti-empathy people. The troll culture, the sarcasm, the irony. The whole, and Jordan Peterson talks about how basically it used to be that our Christian civilization was centered on the death of Christ. That Christ was persecuted. And because Christ, this perfect, innocent, beautiful man, was persecuted, that because of that, we now need to structure our lives in a moral way so as to prevent this terrible incident from ever happening again. Now, in the wake of the Holocaust, and also you look at other people like Martin Luther King, it's set up as the Jewish people were this pure, innocent people. They didn't have a nationalist bone in their body. They didn't have a racist bone in their body. They were all, the Jewish race was a completely female race. It was just women and children. I mean, these are the types. It's not literally spelled out in this way, but these are the implications. The Jewish people were not a martial people. They were not a war-fighting people. They were just a passive lamb. And so there's a huge parallel between how Jesus Christ is described as this perfect sacrifice and how the Jewish people are described in terms of the Holocaust. And also how Martin Luther King is. He was a perfect little lamb, and he never hurt anyone. He just wanted everyone to be the same, and then he was killed. And so the post-Christian morality comes out of things like the Holocaust or Martin Luther King. Although I think it's almost more controversial if Jordan Peterson said, our Western civilization is based on Martin Luther King, and it doesn't really make sense in a European context. But it sounds a lot more negative when you say it that way. Because I think Martin Luther King revisionism is actually more, it's less taboo. I mean, there's no laws against it. You can go to Europe and say Martin Luther King was a communist, a plagiarist, an orgiast, an adulterer, or whatever. And it's not illegal. I mean, you might be arrested for incitement of racial hatred, but it's just not as global as the Holocaust. Now, the Holocaust, no one cares about the Holocaust in China. No one cares about the Holocaust in India. So, when we talk about the Holocaust, it's a very Eurocentric mythology when we talk about this world mythology of the Holocaust. But really, it only applies to majority white countries, majority white populations that really care about the Holocaust. Other people don't really care about it. And so the death of Christ is only a founding mythos for Christian people. If you're not Christian, you don't care about the death of Christ. The Holocaust is only a founding myth for white people. Only white people care about the Holocaust. If you're not white, then the Holocaust is like whatever. Everyone's suffered, everyone's gone through genocides, and Jewish people aren't special. They shouldn't get any special treatment. That's how non-whites view the Holocaust. So, there's a disappearance sort of, as the white population decreases, but also as the white population rethinks itself, because for the last 500 years, white people have been on the ascent. And so every generation of white people could look back and say, hey, we are more powerful in 1600 than we were in 1500. We're more powerful in 1700 than we were in 1600. We're more powerful in 1800 than we were in 1700. And up till 1900, we could say we are more powerful. We're more dominant. We're more populous. We have greater empires. All of this could be said at the turn of the 20th century, that white people had never been better before, and that there was century after century of increasing white supremacy over the globe. But now that we're entering the 21st century, you can't really say that. Now, the population of white people is on the decline, both in absolute numbers and in relative numbers. And culturally, mythologically, white people are on the decline. The religiosity of white people is on the decline. The suicide rate of white people is increasing. So in terms of all this, and these are statistics that I could throw out, but and I could cite the sources, or you could just do a Google search. But regardless of that, what's more important than the actual fact of the matter is more the perception. And I think there is a growing perception among white people that, we're nothing special. We're not the guardians of the galaxy anymore. Which is how, it used to be viewed with the white man's burden, that white people have a responsibility to act as caregivers, and we have the obligation to enact animal cruelty laws and child protection laws and all of these things. We have the noblesse oblige. We have the responsibility to help those who are weaker than us. And a lot of that came out of Christianity. But as Christianity is dying, and now social justice has replaced it, well, I just don't see social justice as a tenable religion given the demographic changes. If we maintained a white majority, then perhaps you could maintain social justice. But social justice is dependent. The founding myth of social justice is white supremacy. And so if white people decline and they, become insignificant, it's going to be very difficult to hold up this mythology of white supremacy. And so social justice is going to fall as a religion very quickly, just as quickly as it replaced Christianity. And something else is going to come after it. And I'm not sure what that's going to be, but I just see a general global malaise of people and part of it's capitalism, right? People care less and less about others. So both I think our intuitive empathy is decreasing and our moral empathy is decreasing. That is, the whole concept that you should feel empathetic toward other people, that whole concept is becoming outmoded and outdated. The whole concept, for instance, the nationalism of 1848, where Poles and Hungarians and Greeks and Croatians, all these different peoples, even if they weren't successful at that time, there was this clear spike in the interest of having their own ethno-state. The reason for that is that the state was viewed as an organization meant to benefit a people, and the concept was that we Hungarians should have our own state to help out our own people. Fundamentally, it was collectivist, and fundamentally, it was empathetic. If you did not care about your fellow Hungarians, then Hungarian nationalism didn't make any sense necessarily. You would just do the best you could as an individual and try to, maybe you would assimilate, maybe you would learn German and identify as a German. And that did happen, right? People would switch, there's all kind of ethnic switching that goes on in Europe. Jews could occasionally convert to Christianity, and then their Ashkenazi ethnic identity would fade away, and they would become part of the majority ethnic group. So this kind of converting between ethnic groups is something that happened. And, so it wasn't necessary. These ethno-nationalist movements were not necessary from the point of view of individualism. But from the point of view of empathy and collectivism, you would grow up and you would see your family was poorer because it was part of a minority ethnic group, and you wanted to change that. You said, we need our own state, a state that advocates for us. So that's fundamentally an empathetic position. You're not looking out for yourself, you're looking out for your family, for your extended family. So there's a fundamental intuitive and a moral empathy in ethno-nationalism. And as ethno-nationalism has declined globally, and as empathy has just declined globally with the fall of Christianity, with the increase of capitalism, with the increase of individualism. Oh, I'm just a citizen of the world, I'm a citizen of the globe, and I'm just trying to make as much money or do my own thing. The whole concept that Peterson has of the Holocaust as a negative founding myth telling us what not to do, I think is disintegrating. And most of what I see as replacing morality, rather than like you can't have sex before marriage, you can't commit a Holocaust, you can't discriminate, you can't do this, can't do that. It's more positive things. It's like you should be sexually liberated, you should be financially independent. So there are these aspirational goals that people have concerning power. You should be proud of who you are, the fat acceptance movement, the self-love movement. So rather than telling you you can't hurt other people, it's more about how to love yourself. So rather than using sticks and saying, don't be a Nazi because that's evil, it's more like you should love yourself, you should accept yourself, you should gain power for yourself, you should become sexually empowered, you should become financially empowered, you should become spiritually empowered, you should understand yourself to be a god in your own right. It's a lot of what these New Age religions and New Age philosophies are about, realizing that you yourself are a god and you have to become who you are, etc., etc. I'm not saying that they made it up in the 21st century, that there weren't precedents for it before. But I see this overall moral shift. And so, given that, I think, is this necessarily good for white people? I don't know. But, there's a lot of groups which are currently dependent upon the goodwill of social justice. There are a lot of groups who their well-being, their standard of living is really dependent upon the welfare that is granted them by the state. And if Christianity falls, and if social justice falls, and there's no empathy left, and everyone's preoccupied with helping themselves, gaining their own financial independence, gaining their own sexual empowerment, and everything's inwardly focused, and there's no empathy, there's no moral empathy, there's no intuitive empathy, and everything is a capitalist rat race to the top. And we're all just trying to be the best pornographer, the best Twitch streamer. We're all whoring for attention. We're all trying to make it. If that is the moral goal, and that's projected as the moral and right, the moral and right thing to do is just to be the best person you can be, rather than helping out other people. If that's what happens, then there are a lot of groups that are currently dependent upon, like a myth of a Holocaust, as Peterson calls it. They're dependent on those kinds of myths, or the myths of Martin Luther King. And it seems like we're seeing a horizon. We're not quite there yet, but we're seeing a moral horizon where it's not going to be a pro-white horizon. It's not going to be a bunch of white people recognize the validity of white collectivism. But it's going to be where the white population declines, and the mixed race population that comes to predominate in America and Europe, this mixed race population, its moral outlook will be shaped by pure capitalism. It will just be a pure merchant-led society without any warrior ethos, without any priestly ethos. So there's going to be no reason for warrior collectivism, camaraderie. There's going to be no reason for the brotherhood of Christ or the body of Christ, the priestly conception of empathy. All that's going to be thrown out the window, and all that will be left is the merchant Freemasonic concept of individualism. And at that point, I don't know if a lot of these minority groups, which survive off the goodwill of others, oh, well, you can't persecute us because that would be Holocaustish, or you can't stop giving us welfare because that would be racist. I think people are going to stop caring about this. And again, it's not necessarily going to be something that's good for white people, but it's potentially dangerous and bad for a lot of non-white groups that benefit from the current reservoir of empathy, both intuitive empathy and the intuitive empathy and the moral empathy. Western civilization is a civilization founded by a very empathetic people. I mean, European people, especially Northern European people, for reasons of climate, for reasons of a Paleolithic versus a Neolithic lifestyle, there's a huge reservoir of instinctual empathy there, and that reinforces itself culturally in the reservoir of moral or cultural empathy. That it is correct, not just that you feel empathy, but that you should be empathetic whether you feel it or not. And that is clearly declining, and I think people are going to start to be affected by this. Like I said, ethno-nationalism, I think, is ultimately an empathetic concept. I think without a form of intuitive and moral empathy, you can't have ethno-nationalism, and states which are dependent upon that are going to fall. So that's all for now. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.